It caught slow, then fast, the ink steaming into the air, words more ephemeral than breath. Outside the knocking came again, harder now, and the voice spoke a name, one Eliza had not wanted to hear. She watched the scrap curl and blacken and throw off a smell of burning truth, and as the last of the ash fell through her fingers, she realized she had given away not just paper, but a thread that might have led them all somewhere safer. The sound of the magistrate's men fell upon the house like rain. Someone outside laughed, a hard, thin sound, and then something else began, the clatter of boots on the stairs. Eliza tucked the ember between the soles of her shoes, feeling the heat sink into the leather. She had burned the names, but coin and ledger and accusation had thicker roots than paper. The lane beyond the window had filled with figures. The magistrate's men moved like a tide. The vicar's calm had curdled into something else, complicit worry or frightened courage. Mr. Caro's voice called, muffled and high. The cleric put a hand to his mouth and prayed in a language Eliza did not know. And then, the knocking at the back door, lower, more urgent. Eliza set her jaw. She had to choose again, stay, face the magistrate's men and explain the ash in her hands, or run and join Sarah at the bell tower, where more hands might be needed and where Mr. Caro's motives could be questioned. She thought of Tom twice over, of the ledger that counted bodies and the bell that tolled without mercy. Her feet moved before she could weigh fear and courage, and as she reached for the cloak she had used to hide sacks, a child began to cry in the next room, a small, fragile sound that split her like winter light through glass. The magistrate's men were at the front now, voices sharper, and the cleric whispered, "For God's sake." The back. Eliza slipped through the narrow passage behind the stove, cloak in hand, and let herself down a crooked cellar stair into the dark that smelled of potatoes and moss. The city closed around her like a fist. Outside someone cursed. A lantern bobbed. The bell tower's hand pointed toward midnight. She moved toward the other door, toward the lane that led to the bell tower, and to Sarah, and to a dozen hands that might, or might not, be allies. She had the ember of the scrap in her pocket and the memory of Mr. Caro's eyes. Something cold and terrible had started that night, and she did not yet know where it would end. As she reached the bottom of the stairs and slid open the small, unseen back hatch, a shape loomed in the darkness, not human, but the mass of a cart blocking her path. A shadow detached itself from the pall of night, and a lantern lifted to reveal a face both familiar and impossible, Mr. Caro. He stepped forward, and the glow caught lines of his jaw that were suddenly raw. He smiled the smile of a man who had been discovered. "Miss Eliza," he said, voice small and precise as a lock. "We need to talk." Eliza's fingers brushed the ember in her pocket. The night around them seemed to lean in, listening. Behind Mr. Caro, the clack of boots drew nearer. The magistrate's men were widening the circle like wolves testing a scent. Eliza swallowed and thought of Tom, of Sarah's ledger, of the blackened scrap. And then she let the back hatch close, the cool air sealing them in like a promise. She had made choices already that could not be unmade. Her throat tightened. "Talk then," she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. "But know this, if you betray us—" She stopped because the end was not yet hers to speak. Outside, a bell struck the hour, and the sound rolled over the river like a warning. Neither of them noticed then the small shape that watched from the shadow of a laundry line, the thread of a plan that had not yet snapped but trembled like a nerve. The lantern at the cart guttered low. A magistrate barked. The night boiled with small, sharp sounds. And in the pocket against Eliza's breast, the ember burned on. The sacks were heavy and smelled of the sea and of wet wood. They were easy to load for those who had been carrying fortune's burdens for years. It was work done in near silence, hands and shoulders answering one another without words. At the river's bend, however, something in the air shifted. A lantern swung at the mouth of a narrow alley. A figure stepped from the light, and the driver, who had been steady as a stone, hissed. "The watch," he said, as if that explained everything. From the shadow of the warehouses a man emerged, not a watchman, but a cleric in a threadbare surplice, his face flint-like under the cap. Behind him were two other figures, faces half-shaded and their hands folded in a way that betrayed concealment. They had their reasons for walking the night. A parish officer who kept tabs on charity, a bailiff who enjoyed the authority Winter gave him, or men hired to look for opportunists who thought the old laws only applied to others. They did not speak in the loudness of justice, but in the quieter, crueler dialect of enforcement. "Good God," the cleric said, not unkindly. "You folks should be in your beds." Sarah stepped forward, and there was a tremor of something in her, not fear, but iron. "We are saving children from dying, Reverend. That is where folk like us belong. You cannot touch goods destined for the quay," the cleric replied. "Property is property even in winter. It's grain," Mr. Caro said, hands open. "It's rotting on the wharf if no one moves it. The ship will sell it to the highest bidder while our children go hungry." The cleric's eyes flicked to the sacks and his mouth thinned. "There are papers, legal claims. If you interfere, you make lawbreakers of yourselves." On the fringe of that argument, a different sort of voice murmured, one whose timbre Eliza recognized without seeing the face that owned it. "There are other papers," said the voice. "Papers that matter more than ledger lines." Silence tilted toward curiosity. The well-made coat moved, pulling something from his inner pocket, not a coin, but a folded sheet of paper. He unfolded it and held it by the lantern, and Eliza saw ink like veins across a map. Lines, names, the signature of someone named Harrowby. The cleric's expression altered. A man must weigh how much law he will press with his tongue. He pressed less now. "What is that?" he asked. "It's proof," Mr. Caro answered. "Proof that some cargo never reached the ledgers. Proof that the magistrates take more than tithes." The cleric swallowed as if the paper were bitter. He looked at the crowd, at Sarah's steadfast jaw, at the driver with coal under his nails, at the women with arms strong from washing linens, at the children with fingers too small for gloves. He hesitated long enough for Eliza to count heartbeats. Then he folded his hands like a man who had learned when to bend without breaking. "In my parish," he said finally, "there are rules. But there is also mercy. If you will allow an accounting, and if you will promise to disperse to the most needy first." "We are dispersing now," Sarah said. "Children's names on my list. Mrs. Fenwick, the mission. I have those I will not leave hungry." The cleric nodded and stepped back as if he had decided mercy was better served by a different brand of law. The watchman's lanterns swayed, and the driver hunkered low as if he had been spared a lash he had been expecting. They loaded and moved. Then, under a sky that seemed to hold its breath, and carried the sacks to where it would do most good. Eliza walked with two and felt each step like a small victory. Sweat chilled on the back of her neck as the cold air pressed. Her breath fogged. When they arrived at Sarah's basement, children's faces, round with sleep and curiosity, peered from between blankets. One boy, no bigger than Tom, clutched a wooden top and wiped his nose on a sleeve before he accepted the taste of a single spoonful of broth. Eliza placed the first of the flour sacks down and felt an ache in her shoulders and the lift of something like triumph. They worked through the night until the city's bells began to thump in the distant square, calling the new day. They split the flour into portions, tied it into rationed bags, and left lists of names with Sarah and the mission on Pritchard Street. The act of sharing made the night less dark. For a moment, in the rounded hush of the basement, the world felt repairable. On the way home, Eliza's coat snagged on a nail. She cursed softly and made to free it, and that is when she noticed a small scrap of paper fluttering in the wake of her step. She bent to pick it up, and it was the same handwriting, steady, urgent. She unfolded it under the lamplight and read, "They know we moved it. Expect trouble. Burn the list if the magistrates ask for names. Do not trust Mr. Caro. Meet the bell tower again." The paper trembled in her fingers, not from the cold, but from a new, thin sort of fear. Mr. Caro, his coat had been too clean, his smile too ready. The note's last lines bit, "Do not trust Mr. Caro." She folded the scrap and stuffed it into her pocket, and for a moment the city around her tilted. Had he been the savior or the snake? Had the cleric's hesitation been mercy or complicity? She thought of Tom asleep with his hand on the hem of her dress, and of the ledger at the mission where names were written in a looping human hand. The night had offered a small victory. The dawn might take it back. When she reached the lane, she saw lights flick in windows and a hush broken by the distant roll of a cart. A shadow fell across her doorway as someone approached with deliberate steps. She looked up and recognized the silhouette. The cleric, hat in hand, breath clouding in the air. "Miss Eliza," he said, voice softer than the night. "May I come in?" "There is word at the vicarage that a complaint has been lodged." Eliza's hand went to the scrap in her pocket and then to the coin behind her ear. The lantern in the street gutter guttered like a dying mind. She must choose. She must decide if the evening's deeds would be explained away, or if she must keep Tom hidden and the lists burnt. She could see, even now, the magistrate's ledger reaching for them like a long, cold hand. Before she could answer, another voice called from further down the lane, a voice rough with urgency. "Eliza, come quick!" Eliza turned. The voice belonged to Mrs. Fenwick. She stood at the corner, cloak drawn, eyes white with something between grief and anger. From behind her came a boy, not the small one from the mission, but Jacob Fenwick, who had been at the docks and had learned, like Tom, to read the slant of a man's shoulder. He clutched his coat, and in that grip was the story of a man who had lost much. "You must come," Mrs. Fenwick said, and her hand trembled in a way that made Eliza's bones cold. "The magistrate's men have come. They're asking for names. They have Mr. Caro. They say he gave them papers." "They'll come here. They'll want lists. Your name is on someone's tongue, miss." Eliza's heart hammered as if it wanted to run. She could see the shape of what might come, the workhouse, the magistrate's ledger. Tom pressed against the cold. The scrap in her pocket burned as if it held fever, and the night around her grew louder. Boots on stone, a cart creaking, the distant bells echo like a warning. She made one decision that was both small and monumental. She tucked the scrap into her bodice and stepped forward. Toward Mrs. Fenwick, toward the shape of what she could not yet name but must face. The lane narrowed as they walked together, and not far behind them, in the square where the river curved and the warehouses kept their secrets, the magistrate's men were lighting lanterns like small suns, and a cart steered toward the vicarage with Mr. Caro bound upon it. He moved with a man who knew too well how to accept a fall, his face folded in a way that hid his thoughts. The cleric fell in beside Eliza, one hand on his chest as if to steady a heart. They reached the Fenwick's narrow doorway, where the smell of boiling cabbage and broth leaked like hope. The magistrate's men were close now, their shadows lengthening. Voices raised in argument carried through the pane of glass. Eliza's fingers tightened around the scrap, feeling the ink through linen. There was a sound like glass breaking from the square, distant but sharp. "Quick," Mrs. Fenwick whispered. "If they come with the magistrate's warrant, we burn the list." The cleric finished for her, and his voice had an edge Eliza had not heard before. "We must not let names be read aloud. We must not hand over the little ones." He met Eliza's eyes then, and in that meeting she saw a decision made on a different plane, a man who had taken vows now choosing who he would protect. They moved inside, and the world seemed to compress into the small room where the Bronfen stove had gone out, and children's slippers were scattered like petals. Tom slept on, breath shallow, trusting as only the young could be. Eliza loosened the scrap, prepared to set it alight in the hearth when a low, slow knocking sounded at the front door, 3 strong, deliberate knocks that matched the cadence of authority. Mrs. Fenwick's hand flew to her mouth. The clerk's lips quivered between words. Outside, a voice called, "Mrs. Fenwick!" "Open at once!" By virtue of the sentence broke. The air in the lane seemed to hold its breath. Eliza felt her pulse against her throat, a small fierce drum. She cupped the scrap and for a heartbeat hesitated between saving the words and saving the truth. The flame of a candle guttered as if the city itself considered whether it should burn. Then, as the magistrate's voice climbed like a rope to the stars, Eliza struck the paper between fingers and the candle flame. Yet within that brutality there was endurance. People stitched rags into quilts, shared food with neighbors, and held on to rituals. Christmas, a borrowed ribbon, a candle at a window, that offered brief warmth of spirit. Women kept households together with ingenuity. Children displayed stubborn resilience. Communities pooled what little they had. The visible suffering of winter prompted reformers to argue for better housing, sanitation, and labor protections. Charitable networks grew, and though reforms were slow, those efforts planted seeds that would, in time, change the city. Looking back, Victorian winters remind us that survival was earned daily through toil, sacrifice, and sheer stubbornness. They show how the comfort of some was often built on the struggle of many, and how a season of weather could become a mirror for social inequality. Winter in 19th century London was more than cold air and frost. It revealed who thrived, who suffered, and who endured. And in that reflection we still find echoes of our own world, where resilience and inequality walk side by side. Eliza had learned, in the way that comes from 12 winters of economy and small betrayals, how to turn a single candle into 2 hours of warmth. She could stand at the kitchen grate and coax a pan of stew into smelling more generous, adding a scrap of fat, a handful of barley, a bay leaf she'd traded for a button. Her hands bore the map of her life, needle-pricked tips, a thin scar across the left knuckle where a tailor's awl had slipped one autumn, and the darkened lines of long washings. When she moved from the hearth to the narrow bed she and her brother shared, she folded her limbs like a seam and tried not to think about the hollow space beneath her ribs that gnawed when the barley ran low. Tom, 2 years younger and forever complaining of cold more loudly than he felt it, had the habit of waking at odd hours and listening. He had the ears of a child used to eavesdropping for pennies, for the location of a good tip, the creak of a door where a purse might be forgotten, the cadence of a boot if a customer from the docks had come calling late and was willing to trade a tale for ale. His smallness was an advantage in the markets. He could wedge himself between crates and count the coppers tucked away in coat pockets. But that winter had thinned his bravado. His cheeks were sharper, and the small cough that had haunted him since September had grown a little louder. At night they lived above a shop that sold ribbon by the yard and other pretty things for women who had the leisure to be particular. Mrs. Hargreaves, the shopkeeper, kept her coal ordered in neat stacks and her hands silk-soft from gloves and ointments. She had a way of looking at Eliza that was not unkind, a calculation wrapped in concern. Eliza mended shirts and corset linings for her in the afternoons, and in return, Mrs. Hargreaves sometimes let the children of the shop take home stale buns or a warm scrap of pie. It was not charity so much as a business arrangement, a dozen patched cuffs for the price of a small mercy. Still, each bun tasted like a brief illicit luxury. On market days, Eliza watched the city change its face. The stalls swelled with desperate abundance and even more desperate buyers. A butcher would fling down a joint, its cut glistening with the sheen of winter, and an argument would start, the altercation of need versus price. The hawkers' voices braided with the clatter of shoes on flagstones, and steam rose from cauldrons into the cold as if the city were exhaling. Eliza learned the worth of a moment, how to catch a coin that fell from a customer's glove, how to put aside a cabbage leaf for later, how to barter a mending for an extra half-pint of coal. The year that the snow lasted longest, the parish workhouse added a new name to its grim list, Mr. Fenwick, the laborer who had once worked the docks and could hold a crate like a man holds a child. He had kept his pride until the day the landlord's letter was nailed to the gate and his family's furniture was set out on the street. When a neighbor stole a seared joint from his doorstep, no one blamed the hand that reached. They blamed hunger and a system that could turn a fallow fortnight into ruin. Mr. Fenwick's eldest daughter accepted a place in service, leaving behind a ribbon and a look that lasted longer than the ribbon itself. It was in the gray of one such morning, when breath white and bodies huddled, that Eliza found a folded scrap lodged in the shutters above the shop. It had been pushed there by some hurried hand and stuck as if shy against the wood. Inside was a note written in a steady, urgent hand. Meet at the old bell tower at dusk. Bring what you can spare. Do not come alone. Eliza read it 3 times, tasting the words like a new spice. The bell tower was in the part of town where the poor met with the poorer, where reformers sometimes gave out pamphlets, and where men with ties and fine coats pretended to listen. She wondered at the instruction. Do not come alone. It might have been a precaution. It might have been a trap. It might have been a chance. She tucked the note into the lining of her apron and left for work with her heart a small, sudden drum. That day was one of those when the world seemed held together by little things. A thread looped through a hem, the soot wiped carefully from a hearth, the smile rewarded with a penny. Mrs. Hargreaves spoke of a charitable dinner to be held at the vicarage, where the pews would be filled with those who gave, and their mouths would do the charity-looking while the poor would look on. Eliza wanted to scoff, but the shopkeeper's fingers trembled as she buttoned a coat. Even those who gave were not untouched by winter. At dusk, the bell tower stood like a dark tooth in the skyline, an old sentinel that overlooked a stretch of the river now rimed with ice. A small group had gathered, a woman in a patched cloak with a bundle of quilts, a young man with soot under his fingernails clutching a battered satchel, and at the edge of the crowd a figure whose coat was too clean and whose shoes were too well made. The last made Eliza wary. "She is always searching for an advantage the city will pay for," Tom would say later, his eyes bright with that mixture of suspicion and hope that belonged to the young. The voice that called them together belonged to Sarah Hemsley, a woman with hair the color of ash and a laugh that had been browned by too many winters. She ran a soup kitchen in a basement and kept meticulous accounts in a ledger that looked as if it had known better times. She had pulled the community's scant charities into a loose net, a place to call when a child foundered, a stack of blankets here, a petition there. She had not the money to challenge parish politics, but she had the stubbornness to rattle its cages. "It's worse this year," Sarah said, and even the well-made coat's expression shifted. "We've had reports from the East End. Coal prices are through the roof because of the dock's strike. Ships sit with grain and can't get in. The hospitals are fuller than the church boxes say." "There's a man." She paused and looked at them all. "There's a man in the square tonight who says he can move a few sacks of flour. He won't until he knows there are hands willing to do the moving." A murmur rose. The well-made coat, who introduced himself as Mr. Caro, spoke then, with the ease of someone used to being heard. "I have a friend by the river who owes me a favor," he said. "If we can gather wagons and some honest labor." "This isn't honest labor," Sarah cut in, voice low. "It's smuggling. The customs men will take our heads, and the magistrates will make an example." Her eyes rested on Eliza a moment longer than necessary. "But it's a way to keep children from starving." Eliza's fingers went to the coin sewn behind her ear, a habit from childhood, a private treasurer. She had not saved much. Enough for bread for 3 days and a busier heart. The thought of flour unmeasured in sacks made her inhale in a way that felt like stealing heat. She thought of Tom's cough and the fellow in their lane with a baby whose cheeks were the very color of the raw peel of a turnip. She thought of how hunger made people do things they would not have done otherwise. On the other side of the coin was fear, of being caught, of being hauled to the workhouse, of being the name in a ledger. On the other side was Tom asleep with a hand on the hem of her dress. They arranged to meet near the old warehouses where the river arched and the mills kept their mouths closed. The plan was simple as desperation. Gather willing hands, split into teams, carry what could be carried into sympathetic hands, to Sarah's basement, to Mrs. Fenwick's lean kitchen, to the mission on Pritchard Street. They would not take anything that bore a stamp of private contract, not to be thieves, merely to redistribute what the winter had hoarded and would not share. Mr. Caro supplied a cart with a driver who looked like he had been born in a back lane and learned to look away well. Sarah supplied a list of names and a space that smelled of leeks and boiled bones. On the night they moved, the river breathed steam and the moon lay low and gull-like above the roofs. Eliza wrapped her scarf twice, tucked the note into her pocket, and found Tom awake, counting his breaths as if that could keep the cough at bay. "Where are you?" he whispered. "To fetch the moon," Eliza joked, doing what she could to make his voice smile instead of shiver. "Bring an extra scarf. If you're awake, you're getting cold." He climbed into bed and murmured, "Bring flour." They walked with a small troop that smelled of sweat and hope and coal. A child with a sprig of holly in his cap led the way until they reached the warehouses, where shadows waited like animals at the lip of the light. Crime rose in winter not as a simple moral failing, but as a consequence of scarcity. Pickpockets and gangs prospered in crowds. Burglars targeted pantries and coal stores because fuel could keep a family alive. Children were often the ones sent into the streets to steal or hawk stolen goods. For many families, a snatched coin could mean a meal. Prostitution grew as other incomes vanished, and courts swelled with those punished for acts driven by hunger. In those months, the line between survival and criminality wore thin. Entertainment became a vital refuge. Theaters of the West End glittered with gas chandeliers and orchestras, offering the middle and upper classes theater, opera, and spectacle. Music halls served as the beating heart of popular winter life. Cheap, noisy, and warm, they offered songs, jokes, and an evening of shared relief from cold. Penny gaffs, street performers, and carol singers filled alleys and squares, bringing laughter and small wonders to people who otherwise had little cause for joy. These pleasures weren't frivolous. They were nourishment for the spirit. Travel in winter was an ordeal. Horses slipped on frozen cobbles. carriages overturned, and fog reduced visibility to a few shuddering feet. Pedestrians slogged through slush in thin shoes. Children running errands risked disappearing into the mist. Railways helped but were vulnerable to snow and ice too, stranding passengers in cold stations. Lamplighters, policemen, and street sweepers labored to keep the city moving, often against futile odds. The sheer scale of London meant a single storm could bring the metropolis to a halt. The strain on food supplies tightened the city's divisions. Markets like Billingsgate, Covent Garden, and Smithfield bustled at dawn with traders hacking at frozen fish and vegetables, but frozen rivers and delayed barges could push prices up overnight. For the wealthy, winter feasts continued: roast birds, exotic fruits, and rich puddings. For the poor, bread, potatoes, and thin broths were the staples, and a roasted chestnut from a street brazier might be the day's only hot bite. Coal shortages made cooking harder, and malnutrition left children especially vulnerable. Across all these hardships, small mercies and acts of care mattered. Churches and mission halls offered soup, blankets, and shelter. Charities organized coal distributions and seasonal dinners. Neighbors shared what little they had. The workhouse and prison loomed as grim options, places of shelter that demanded dignity in exchange for survival, and many resisted until they had no choice. Yet even amid institutional cruelty, people found ways to look after one another: a shared blanket, a bowl of broth, a candle-lit carol service. Those flickers of warmth didn't erase winter's cruelty, but they kept life going, day by day, until spring. Butchers displayed carcasses stiffened by frost, their knives flashing in the dim light as they cut portions for customers. Farmers from the countryside brought what little produce they could salvage: turnips, cabbages, and potatoes hardy enough to withstand the cold. Still, scarcity was always a threat. Frost ruined crops, snow blocked rural transport, and livestock weakened without proper pasture. Prices climbed, and for many the basics slipped out of reach. A loaf of bread or a pound of coal could eat an entire day's wages. Families learned to stretch thin soups with scraps of bone or cabbage leaves while street vendors hawked hot potatoes, roasted chestnuts, and mugs of wheat coffee, cheap, filling, warming, but hardly nourishing. Preserving food was its own struggle. Without reliable refrigeration, meat spoiled quickly unless smoked or salted. In winter, the cold sometimes helped, but kitchens were harder to manage. Cooking fires had to heat the home as well as prepare meals, and fuel was too costly to waste. Meals were often simple and rushed, eaten before hearth embers burned low. The wealthy, by contrast, turned winter into a season of culinary indulgence. Their kitchens produced elaborate roasts, puddings, and pies studded with imported luxuries: oranges, spices, sugar, while markets supplied oysters, venison, and exotic fruits. Christmas feasts laid this out starkly, tables sagging under goose and plum pudding as much of the city went hungry. The sight was cruelly public. One child pressed a face to a bakery window at pastries glittering with sugar, while another on the same street gnawed a stale crust bought for pennies. Food in winter was never just sustenance. It was a marker of inequality etched across every market stall and table. Reformers and charities tried to bridge that gap. Soup kitchens ladled out thin broths, churches distributed bread and coal at Christmas, and philanthropists funded penny dinners so children could count on a hot meal. Yet demand always outstripped supply. For countless Londoners, hunger was as much a part of winter as frostbite or coughs. If winter was a trial, women bore its heaviest burdens. They were the unseen managers of survival, stretching every penny, stoking the faintest fire, and shielding families from the season's cruelty. Working-class women rose before dawn to light fires if fuel existed, to prepare a meal scraped together from a few scraps, to fetch water from public pumps in biting frost, and to wash clothes with hands plunged into near-freezing water. They patched children's clothes, stitched rags into quilts, and traded favors with neighbors to keep the household functioning. Many also brought in income, sewing, mending, laundry for wealthier families, or selling fish, flowers, or hot drinks on market corners for meager pay. Widows and unmarried women were especially vulnerable, sometimes forced toward the streets or domestic service to survive. In times of absolute need, the line between respectable labor and desperate measures blurred. Middle-class women faced different pressures: managing servants, organizing coal deliveries, and orchestrating household respectability. They directed festive gatherings and philanthropic efforts, sewing blankets or distributing food, acts that softened inequality yet also reinforced social hierarchies. Across all classes, winter revealed women's resilience. They nursed the sick, economized supplies, and kept children clothed and fed. The rhythm of winter life often depended on their quiet, relentless labor. No one suffered winter's cruelty more than children. Small, malnourished, and vulnerable, they were often put to work when other children elsewhere stayed home to play. Poor children trudged barefoot or in threadbare boots through slush to sell matches, newspapers, or flowers. Their numb fingers barely held what they sold. Many lived in damp, unheated rooms where 2 or 3 siblings shared a single thin blanket. Frostbite and chilblains left lasting scars. School attendance fell in winter because children were needed to earn pennies. Those who did attend sometimes sat shivering in unheated classrooms, breath fogging the air as they copied lessons on slate. Disease shadowed them too. Measles, whooping cough, pneumonia, influenza, and tuberculosis took a terrible toll. Hospitals overflowed and graveyards filled with tiny coffins. Yet children still found ways to survive and to play. Snow, when it came, could turn streets into rough playgrounds. Snowballs thrown, slides built from frozen puddles, laughter ringing through alleys. Charities and churches tried to help. Ragged schools offered hot meals and some warmth, and at Christmas missions handed out small gifts that lit up faces with a sudden joy. For wealthier children, winter memory could be of skating on private ponds and toys by the fire, a gulf in experience that made the season's injustice painfully visible. For the working poor, winter was relentless. Dockers unloaded ships in frozen spray, their clothes soaked and their hands cracked. Builders balanced on icy beams. Costermongers shouted into fog with barrows of vegetables, their profits tiny and uncertain. Street sellers hawked hot potatoes and chestnuts, carrying with them a little heat and a day's hope of income. Factories provided shelter from wind but brought grim conditions of dust, smoke, and damp under dim gaslight. Women and children in factories breathed foul air that sapped strength as surely as the frost outside. Unemployment lurked like a specter. Storms halted construction, frozen rivers delayed shipments, crops failed, and a single missed paycheck could mean eviction, hunger, or the workhouse. Families eked out survival by patching boots, burning scraps of wood, and living on bread, tea, and the occasional scrap of meat. Solidarity mattered. Neighbors shared a crust of bread, a handful of coal, or a place by a communal fire. Taverns, despite their reputation, offered warmth and companionship, brief reprieves from the cold. As winter finally loosened its grip and the first buds of spring appeared, Londoners breathed easier. But the season left scars, in bodies weakened by hunger and illness, and in the memory of a city divided. For the wealthy it had been an inconvenience softened by roaring fires and grand entertainments. For the middle classes, a test of thrift and decorum. For the poor, a relentless adversary that tore families apart and claimed lives. One could walk past a mansion blazing with light and, around the corner, find a family shivering in a doorway. The same snow that delighted children in Kensington Gardens starved families in Whitechapel. Through frost and fog, through hunger and illness, Londoners kept going the only way they could, by working, by sharing, and by clinging to small sparks of warmth and kindness. Those everyday acts, the vendor's brazier, the neighbor's blanket, the mission's bowl of soup, did not erase the cold, but they did make tomorrow a little more likely. Soup kitchens became a winter refuge for the very poorest, a thin bowl of broth and a roll that never tasted like abundance, but for a few hours it kept hunger at bay. At Christmas, these humble offerings sometimes swelled into something brighter. Charitable organizations organized special dinners of roast beef and plum pudding, feeding thousands who would otherwise have gone without. Those meals, modest beside the banquets of the wealthy, were nonetheless treasured, a rare taste of joy in a season otherwise defined by want. Drink threaded itself through winter life in complicated ways. Alcohol was a kind of false hearth. Gin, rum, and brandy warmed hands and numbed troubles for a little while, and taverns filled with people chasing that brief comfort. For the poorest, cheap gin could be both balm and trap. It burned and took the edge off the cold, but it did nothing to fill empty bellies or mend broken homes. Ale and beer offered camaraderie. Men gathered after long, icy shifts to share a pint and a story, while the middle and upper classes sipped mulled wine or spiced cider at festive gatherings. In grand dining rooms, brandy and port completed winter feasts. In humble alehouses, a mug could mean warmth and fellowship. Reformers railed against the damage drink could do, yet for many it remained one of the few small consolations against frost and hunger. The workhouse cast a long shadow over winter life. Created to offer relief, it was deliberately harsh, a deterrent as much as a refuge. When frost tightened its grip, queues formed at the gates. Men, women, and children who had exhausted every other option. Inside, families were split apart, meals were plain gruel, and labor was the price of shelter. Dormitories were cold, blankets few, and disease spread quickly in the crowded halls. Still, for those with nowhere else to go, the workhouse could mean survival. Its shelter came at the cost of dignity, and many resisted admission until they simply could not go on. Winter made the workhouse both scar and salvation. Prisons in winter were a harsher echo of that cruelty. Cells were small and unheated, stone walls soaking up the cold. Food was thin and labor continued regardless of weather. Isolation in a chilly cell could crush the spirit as surely as a heavy sentence, and disease too found its way through crowded yards and wards. For inmates, the season stretched out as a test of endurance, where each day was measured not only in hours, but in the struggle to keep body and mind intact. When work dried up and food became scarce, crime rose as desperation sharpened. Pickpockets and petty thieves made use of fog-bound crowds. Children, quick and small, were often sent to dart through markets and snatch a coin. Burglars targeted pantries and coal sheds, stealing fuel as much as food. Prostitution increased, too, as women with no other means turned to the streets to survive. Courts filled with those punished for acts born of hunger, and magistrates faced the cruel choice between harsh deterrence and compassion. Winter blurred the line between survival and lawbreaking, revealing how little room the poorest had to choose. Medical care proved unequal and uncertain. The wealthy could summon physicians to warm, well-staffed homes where nurses and good food aided recovery. For the rest, hospitals were often overcrowded charity wards, and medicines were as likely to be palliative as curative. Laudanum for pain, mustard plasters for chest troubles, cod liver oil for the weak. Quack remedies thrived in winter too, their patent bottles promising miracles to those desperate enough to buy hope. Home cures, onion syrup for coughs, goose fat rubbed on chests, warm bricks wrapped in cloth, were common and sometimes comforting, but often inadequate against epidemics. The medical world itself was in flux. Old ideas about miasma contended with emerging germ theory, and public health reformers used winter crises to press for better housing, clean water, and ventilation. For most families, survival depended less on doctors than on having enough warmth, food, and rest to see the season through. Food and clothing were blunt measures of inequality. Wealthy households feasted on roast birds, exotic fruits, and rich puddings. Their tables celebrated abundance and display. For the poor, winter meals narrowed to bread, potatoes, and thin broths. Street vendors roasted chestnuts or hot potatoes a rare and welcome heat. Coal shortages made cooking difficult, and malnutrition left children thin and vulnerable to disease. Clothing was survival, tailored overcoats and furs for some, patched rags for others, with mothers mending by lamplight to keep small bodies as warm as possible. Even a single scuttle of coal could mean the difference between a night spent shivering and one spent with a hearth's faint glow. Children felt winter most sharply. Privileged youngsters might skate on private ponds and unwrap toys by a warm tree, but for many others, childhood was work. Hawking matches, polishing boots, scavenging coal, or sweeping crossings in the cold. Infant mortality rose in the frost. Overcrowded, damp rooms turned simple coughs into deadly fevers. Yet even in hardship, children found pockets of joy. A snowball thrown in an alley, the steam of a vendor's hot chestnut, a shared game between chores. Ragged schools, mission halls, and charitable feasts tried to ease their burden, offering a hot meal, a warm room, or a small gift at Christmas. Those gestures could not save everyone, but they kept some small lives going a little longer. Through all of this, the queues at soup kitchens, the brazier fires on street corners, the lines at workhouse gates, winter in Victorian London revealed a city of harsh contrasts and quiet courage. People scavenged, bartered, and worked in every way they could. Charities and churches distributed coal, blankets, and food. Neighbors shared the last of their coins. It was a season that tested bodies and spirits, but also one in which small acts of kindness and stubborn resilience shone through the fog. Those flickers of warmth, a bowl of soup, a shared blanket, a single candle in a dim room, were reminders that even in the coldest months, life endured. Winter sermons in Victorian London carried a particular weight. Preachers leaned into images of light piercing darkness, of hearths chasing back the cold, turning the fog and frost outside into metaphors for sin, poverty, and despair. Hymns rose in the chill air with a mix of melancholy and stubborn hope, their voices threading above the coughs and the crackle of fires. For many, that service was more than ritual. It was a moment of consolation when the world beyond the church doors felt relentless and indifferent. Among the middle and upper classes, winter religion often doubled as a performance of respectability. Regular attendance signaled moral standing. Donations to parish charities reinforced an image of benevolence as people returned to warm parlors and full tables. Homes and churches were dressed in evergreen wreaths, candles, and nativity scenes that linked the dead season to the promise of renewal. Those symbols softened winter's bleakness, reminding people that life could persist even when the streets looked lifeless. But faith in Victorian London was not without its tensions. Some clergy and reformers asked why a just God would allow such suffering to persist in the city's icy slums. Their argument was blunt. True Christianity should tackle structural poverty, not merely preach endurance. Those debates cut deepest in winter, when warm-furred worshippers left chapels while beggars waited outside in the cold. Still, for countless Londoners of every class, religion offered an anchor, meaning and the strength to face another day until spring. When dusk fell, winter nights dropped like a heavy curtain. Darkness came early and the city changed shape. Fog, dense with coal smoke and damp, swallowed lamplight and turned familiar streets into a world of silhouettes. Horse-drawn carriages rattled past, vendors hawked hot chestnuts and thin coffee under lantern glow, and children darted through crowds selling matches and papers. For many, the night was not a pause from labor, but a second, colder stage of survival. Night also brought danger. Pickpockets used the confusion of fog and half-light to vanish into crowds. Prostitutes, many young and desperate, called from shadowed alleys. Drunken brawls spilled out of taverns. Police patrolled with lanterns and batons, but order in those maze-like winter streets was always fragile. Homeless men and women huddled in doorways and under bridges, and frost sometimes claimed lives quietly in the corners, unnoticed until morning light. Yet the winter night had a strange beauty too. Gas lamps cast halos on wet cobbles, church bells tolled through the haze, and the city could feel oddly otherworldly, a setting ripe for poets and painters. That interplay of menace and wonder made London by night both a theater of desperation and a stage for endurance, where communities were formed as much out of necessity as out of kindness. Light itself shaped the season. Gaslight was a marvel of progress but also made the streets eerie, the fog distorting shapes into ghostly halos. For the wealthy it extended evenings of theater and society. For everyone else it stretched the hours when danger and opportunity mingled. The half-light hid thieves as much as it revealed modernity's gains, and long winter nights turned travel and movement into tests of caution and luck. All too often the law offered little mercy, sending people into cells or hard labor that only deepened their misery. Across the city, fire and flame defined survival. For the wealthy, keeping hearths crackling was a matter of servants and cellars stocked with coal. Parlors glowed and bedrooms stayed warm through the night. For the poor, fuel was an endless struggle. Coal was expensive, and a single scuttle had to be stretched over days. Families scavenged wood from riverbanks, pried apart old furniture, or risked stealing from delivery carts. When they burned rags or scrap, the smoke often choked the room more than the heat warmed it. Fire could also be a danger. In cramped tenements, a stray spark might ignite curtains or bedding, and whole buildings could go up in furious, deadly blazes. Still, a small brazier on a street corner, a tin foot warmer in a cab, or a single ember nurtured through the night could mean everything. Even the poorest households gathered around a faint flame to share stories and warmth, the light binding them together against a season that otherwise threatened to break them. Entertainment and faith offered other kinds of sustenance. Theaters, concert halls, and private balls glittered for those who could afford them. The wealthy turned winter into a season of spectacle and social ritual. For working people, pubs and music halls provided noisy, crowded refuges where laughter and song chased away the gloom for a few hours. Street performers, fire eaters, and jugglers drew children's eyes in foggy alleys. Cheap theaters and skating on frozen ponds brought rare delight. Winter amusements were not mere distractions. They were fuel for the spirit, small rebellions against hunger and cold. Religion deepened in winter. Churches and mission halls became sanctuaries of warmth, charity, and consolation. Sermons urged compassion, even as some clergy blamed the poor for their plight. Still, charity flowed. Soup kitchens, blanket drives, and donated coal eased immediate needs. Sunday schools gave children warmth, companionship, and sometimes a hot meal. For many slum kids, the only schooling they would ever see. Candlelit carol services offered moments of beauty that cut through the fog, voices lifting hope into the cold air. Through all of this, trades, river danger, workhouses, crime, fire, entertainment, and faith, a single truth persisted. Winter in Victorian London tested everyone. It revealed a city where survival depended on a fragile mix of industry, charity, law, and stubborn human kindness. Neighbors pooled a few coins for coal, strangers shared a blanket, missions handed out a bowl of soup. These small acts did not erase the cold, but they kept people alive long enough to face another dawn. Mothers still sent daughters out to sell flowers in winter, though blooms would wither the moment frost touched them. Fathers taught sons to polish boots on cold street corners, wrists numb from icy slush. Every small trade, a basket of chestnuts, a box of matches, a polished shoe, told the same story, resilience born of necessity. Competition was fierce and profit was thin, but those meager coins often meant the difference between a warm meal and another night in the cold. Survival in the city was rarely steady. It was carved out chestnut by chestnut, penny by penny. The Thames was the city's pulse, and in winter it took on a harsher mood. Ice crept along the banks, barges fought sluggish currents, and coal shipments that should have kept hearths burning were delayed. A single freeze could push prices up and leave whole neighborhoods shivering. Fog wrapped the river in a choking hush. Ferrymen moved by lantern light while passengers huddled and prayed for a safe crossing. Yet even then the river offered small miracles. When ice held, children skated along the edges, and, for rare hours, the city remembered how to play on its surface. For others the river was danger and sorrow, a place where accidents happened, and where the desperate sometimes vanished into the cold water. Its winter face was both beautiful and merciless, a mirror of London itself. No institution captured that bitter edge more than the workhouse. In winter its doors could mean food, a bed, and a fire, and also the breaking up of families, strict rules, and hard labor. People queued in thin coats, hoping for admission. Some were turned away when halls were full. Those who went inside found warmth that was meager and constant separation from loved ones, men one way, women another, children sent to their own wards. The work was grueling, the food plain, and disease spread quickly through drafty dormitories. Still, when frost and hunger converged, the workhouse could be the thin line between life and death, grim, humiliating, but sometimes the only option. Winter also pushed many toward crime. When jobs vanished and food ran out, petty theft, burglary, and fraud rose. Pickpockets used fog-bound crowds to their advantage. Children, quick and small, were often the ones sent forward to snatch a coin or a handkerchief. Burglars looked for coal and pantry scraps rather than jewelry, because fuel could keep a family alive another day. Prostitution increased as other incomes disappeared, and courts grew crowded with those punished for acts born of desperation. To walk London's streets in winter was to watch how closely survival and lawlessness could blur when hunger was the driving force. Fire, its presence or absence, defined so much of daily life. In grand homes, hearths blazed from room to room, servants keeping fires stoked while families dined and socialized in comfort. In the slums, coal was expensive and fires were tiny. People scavenged driftwood, broke up old furniture, or stretched a single scuttle of coal across days. Those makeshift flames often produced smoke more than warmth, and cramped rooms made accidental fires a terrifying risk. Yet that same fragile light also brought community. Neighbors gathered around brazier flames, shared stories, and drew what comfort they could from a single ember. Across the city, People sought escape where they could find it. For those who could afford it, theaters, concerts, and private balls turned winter into a season of spectacle. For working people, taverns, music halls, and cheap theaters offered noisy refuge, a few hours where laughter drowned the wind. Street performers braved the cold so children could clap at fire eaters and jugglers, and public skating or a vendor's hot chestnut could lift spirits for a night. These small pleasures were more than distraction. They were nourishment for the spirit. Religion and charity took on added weight in the cold months. Churches and mission halls were warmth and shelter as well as places of worship. Sermons urged compassion. Parishes organized soup kitchens, coal distributions, and blanket drives that literally kept people alive. Sunday schools fed children and offered a rare patch of safety. Candlelit carol services brought communities together in moments of light. Charity often came with conditions, church attendance or moral advice, and sometimes with judgment. But for many it was a lifeline they could not refuse. Neighbors pooled pennies, shared blankets, and took in orphaned children. Those small acts of care became a fragile safety net in a city that otherwise seemed indifferent. Winter drove home a brutal truth. Food, clothing, shelter, and warmth decided who endured and who did not. For the wealthy, tables bowed under roast meats and puddings. For the poor, bread and potatoes were the staples, and street vendors' roasted potatoes or chestnuts might be the only hot meal of the day. Malnutrition left children thin and vulnerable. Mothers often went without so their little ones might eat. Clothing was survival, tailored overcoats and furs for some, patched rags for others, with frostbitten fingers and soaked shoes a common hazard among the poor. Yet even in the hardest conditions, dignity and care persisted. A mother mending a child's coat by candlelight, neighbors tucking a blanket over a shivering visitor. Small acts that kept people going. Children suffered more than anyone. For some, winter meant skating in private gardens and toys beneath the tree. For many more, it meant bare feet on frozen cobbles, thin clothing failing against damp wind, and days spent hawking papers or matches instead of at school. Infant mortality rose in the cold months. Illnesses that began as simple coughs too often became fatal in overcrowded, damp rooms. Still, children found moments of joy. A snowball thrown in an alley, a shared piece of bread, the rare warmth of a vendor's roasted chestnut. Those fleeting pleasures were proof that, even in the bleakest winters, the human spirit, especially in its youngest forms, found ways to flicker on. Winter in Victorian London was a test of resourcefulness. Street trades, chestnuts, baked potatoes, match girls, bootblacks, were more than jobs. They were lifelines. Families scavenged coal from riverbanks, sold whatever they could, and sent children into the streets because every small coin mattered. Charities, reformers, and ragged schools tried to fill the gaps, offering warm meals, clothing, and lessons. But demand always outstripped supply, and for many the season was a struggle to hold on. For the poor, the river was also a place of resource and sorrow. Children scavenged its banks for driftwood or spilled coal. Rag pickers combed the edges for anything of value. But the Thames claimed lives too. Men falling from barges, children slipping from banks, some choosing the water as a final escape from hunger and hopelessness. Still, its winter beauty kept drawing artists and poets, fog curling like ghostly fingers, moonlight trembling on the surface, bells tolling over the water, a reminder that the city's heart was as perilous as it was vital. Few institutions captured both hope and despair like the workhouse. In winter, its role became unmistakable. To some, it offered the only promise of food, a bed, and a fire. To others, it demanded the surrender of freedom, dignity, and family. The system was designed to deter dependence, and the harshness of the gates meant many resisted until frost or hunger left them no choice. Shivering men, women, and children queued for admission. Some were turned away, the halls already full. Inside the workhouse, warmth was relative. Fires burned sparingly, dormitories were cold, and thin blankets did little to keep out the draft. Families were separated at the door, men one way, women another, children to yet another ward, and the psychological blow could be as cruel as the cold. Meals were regular but plain, gruel, bread, the occasional bit of meat. Work was the price of shelter. Men labored breaking stones or repairing ropes in icy yards. Women scrubbed floors and washed garments in freezing water. Children were set to monotonous tasks. Illness spread quickly in such crowded conditions, and for many the workhouse became less a refuge and more a holding place where frail bodies quietly failed. Still, when winter grew truly savage, the workhouse was often the thin barrier between life and death. Cold weather sharpened another reality. Crime rose when opportunity and need collided. With jobs scarce and food harder to find, petty theft, fraud, and burglary increased. Pickpockets used crowded, fog-bound streets to their advantage. Children were often the nimble hands in these schemes, darting through crowds to snatch a coin and disappear into the mist. Burglars targeted pantries and coal stores far more than jewelry, stealing what would keep them warm that night. Some sold watered-down milk or spoiled meat. Others feigned injuries to coax coins from the sympathetic. Prostitution swelled as winter stripped away other ways to earn. For many women, it was a last, dangerous resort to buy fuel or food. When courts filled, magistrates faced a brutal question: punish harshly to deter crime, or show leniency to those driven by hunger. All too often the law offered little mercy, sending people into cells or hard labor that only deepened their misery. Across the city, fire and flame defined survival. For the wealthy, keeping hearths crackling was a matter of servants and cellars stocked with coal. Parlors glowed and bedrooms stayed warm through the night. For the poor, fuel was an endless struggle. Coal was expensive, and a single scuttle had to be stretched over days. Families scavenged wood from riverbanks, pried apart old furniture, or risked stealing from delivery carts. When they burned rags or scrap, the smoke often choked the room more than the heat warmed it. Fire could also be a danger. In cramped tenements, a stray spark might ignite curtains or bedding, and whole buildings could go up in furious, deadly blazes. Still, a small brazier on a street corner, a tin foot warmer in a cab, or a single ember nurtured through the night could mean everything. Even the poorest households gathered around a faint flame to share stories and warmth, the light binding them together against a season that otherwise threatened to break them. Entertainment and faith offered other kinds of sustenance. Theaters, concert halls, and private balls glittered for those who could afford them. The wealthy turned winter into a season of spectacle and social ritual. For working people, pubs and music halls provided noisy, crowded refuges where laughter and song chased away the gloom for a few hours. Street performers, fire eaters, and jugglers drew children's eyes in foggy alleys. Cheap theaters and skating on frozen ponds brought rare delight. Winter amusements were not mere distractions. They were fuel for the spirit, small rebellions against hunger and cold. Religion deepened in winter. Churches and mission halls became sanctuaries of warmth, charity, and consolation. Sermons urged compassion even as some clergy blamed the poor for their plight. Still, charity flowed. Soup kitchens, blanket drives, and donated coal eased immediate needs. Sunday schools gave children warmth, companionship, and sometimes a hot meal. For many slum kids, the only schooling they would ever see. Candlelit carol services offered moments of beauty that cut through the fog, voices lifting hope into the cold air. Through all of this, trades. River danger, workhouses, crime, fire, entertainment, and faith, a single truth persisted. Winter in Victorian London tested everyone. It revealed a city where survival depended on a fragile mix of industry, charity, law, and stubborn human kindness. Neighbors pooled a few coins for coal, strangers shared a blanket, missions handed out a bowl of soup. These small acts did not erase the cold, but they kept people alive long enough to face another dawn. Mothers sent daughters out to sell flowers even in winter, though the blooms would soon wither in the frost. Fathers taught sons to shine boots on cold street corners, fighting icy slush that made the job nearly impossible. Every small trade told the same story, resilience born of desperation. The streets were harsh, competition fierce, and profits meager. Yet those pennies, a chestnut, a match, a polished boot, often meant the difference between a warm meal and another night in the cold. Survival in Victorian London was not built on steady wages. It was carved out coin by coin. The Thames was the city's lifeblood, and in winter it became something else entirely, moody, treacherous, and unpredictable. Frost clenched the river's edges, jagged ice clinging to the banks while tributaries stilled. Bargemen fought a sluggish current, cargoes delayed or spoiled as cold tightened its grip. Coal shipments, vital for keeping homes and factories warm, could be slowed for days, sending prices up and sparking new hardship for families already scraping by. A single freeze on the river could ripple across the whole city, leaving thousands shivering in underheated rooms. Fog turned the Thames into a nightmare. Thick, choking mist swallowed bridges and muffled the cries of sailors. Barges collided in the gloom, cargo slumping into icy water. Ferrymen moved cautiously, their lanterns barely cutting the haze while passengers huddled and prayed for a safe crossing. Yet even the river held moments of wonder. When ice thickened enough, people risked stepping onto its surface. Children skated along the edges. Market stalls sometimes popped up on the frozen expanse, and for brief hours the city seemed to mock the season, refusing to surrender entirely to winter's grasp. For the poor, the river was also a place of resource and sorrow. Children scavenged its banks for driftwood or spilled coal. Rag pickers combed the edges for anything of value. But the Thames claimed lives too. Men falling from barges, children slipping from banks, some choosing the water as a final escape from hunger and hopelessness. Still, its winter beauty kept drawing artists and poets, fog curling like ghostly fingers, moonlight trembling on the surface, bells tolling over the water. A reminder that the city's heart was as perilous as it was vital. Few institutions captured both hope and despair like the workhouse. In winter, its role became unmistakable. To some, it offered the only promise of food, a bed, and a fire. To others, it demanded the surrender of freedom, dignity, and family. The system was designed to deter dependence, and the harshness of the gates meant many resisted until frost or hunger left them no choice. Shivering men, women, and children queued for admission. Some were turned away, the halls already full. Inside the workhouse, warmth was relative. Fires burned sparingly, dormitories were cold, and thin blankets did little to keep out the draft. Families were separated at the door, men one way, women another, children to yet another ward, and the psychological blow could be as cruel as the cold. Meals were regular but plain: gruel, bread, the occasional bit of meat. Work was the price of shelter. Men labored breaking stones or repairing ropes in icy yards. Women scrubbed floors and washed garments in freezing water. Children were set to monotonous tasks. Illness spread quickly in such crowded conditions, and for many the workhouse became less a refuge and more a holding place where frail bodies quietly failed. Still, when winter grew truly savage, the workhouse was often the thin barrier between life and death. Cold weather sharpened another reality. Crime rose when opportunity and need collided. With jobs scarce and food harder to find, petty theft, fraud, and burglary increased. Pickpockets used crowded, fog-bound streets to their advantage. Children were often the nimble hands in these schemes, darting through crowds to snatch a coin and disappear into the mist. Burglars targeted pantries and coal stores far more than jewelry, stealing what would keep them warm that night. Some sold watered-down milk or spoiled meat. Others feigned injuries to coax coins from the sympathetic. Prostitution swelled as winter stripped away other ways to earn. For many women, it was a last, dangerous resort to buy fuel or food. When courts filled, magistrates faced a brutal question: punish harshly to deter crime, or show leniency to those driven by hunger. Sunday schools and mission halls mattered in very practical ways. They offered children warmth, companionship, and sometimes a hot meal. For many slum youngsters, this was the closest thing to schooling they would receive. Candlelit carol services could feel almost miraculous, voices lifting into the cold air and sending music through foggy lanes. Yet the church's role was complicated. Some clergy devoted themselves to relief and comfort. Others used sermons to scold the poor for perceived moral failings, turning aid into judgment. Even so, faith provided a kind of consolation that hearth and food alone could not, a promise that suffering had meaning, and that endurance might be recognized beyond the present frost. Winter also made death a nearer, more visible presence. Frost and fog stole lives quietly and relentlessly. Each morning, constables and workmen might find a body in an alley, under an archway, or on a riverbank. Someone who had curled up against the cold and never woken. Tenement districts saw mortality soar as pneumonia, tuberculosis, and other respiratory illnesses swept through overcrowded, damp rooms. Infants and the elderly were especially vulnerable. Too often a mother would wake to find a child cold and still. Grief compounded by the urgency of simply surviving the next day. Workhouses, meant to provide refuge, sometimes became places where the weak went to die. Overcrowding and poor heating allowed disease to spread. Weakened bodies succumbed under the strain of hard labor and meager diets. Funeral practices only underscored the city's divides. The wealthy arranged elaborate burials with black horses and hired mourners, while the poor were laid to rest with little ceremony, their passing recorded as another line in a ledger. Winter funerals carried a particular somberness, wreaths dusted with frost, breath visible in the air of the graveyard, and the muted rhythm of a city that had learned too well how close life and death could be in the long, cold months. For the poor, death often came stripped of dignity. Coffins, when affordable at all, were plain wooden boxes. Some families went into debt simply to bury a loved one, while others relied on mass graves in potters' fields. The cold earth of London claimed countless poor bodies each winter, their resting places unmarked and quickly forgotten. Yet even amid this sorrow, Victorian culture held a complex relationship with mourning, a fascination with memorials, keepsakes, and the hope of an afterlife. Black clothing, memorial photographs, and even locks of hair became ways to keep the departed near, small rituals that insisted love endured beyond the frost. Still, for those living on the edge, death was less ceremony and more reminder. Each passing meant they themselves stood only a little further from safety. When illness spread with the cold, access to medical care exposed the city's inequalities. The wealthy saw physicians at home, doctors who made house calls, carrying bags of instruments and tinctures, able to call on nurses and servants and to rest beside warm fires while receiving treatments that, for all their limits, offered some comfort. For the poor, hospitals like St. Thomas's and Guy's filled quickly. Wards became overcrowded, beds scarce, and many were turned away. Those admitted found drafty rooms where disease jumped from bed to bed with terrifying ease. Nurses worked tirelessly but with thin resources. Medicines were often palliatives, laudanum for pain, mustard plasters for the chest, cod liver oil for the weak, and family remedies filled the gaps. Mothers dosed children with onion syrup for coughs, rubbed goose fat on chests, or warmed bricks wrapped in cloth to soothe fevers. Charitable dispensaries and mission clinics offered relief, but demand usually outstripped supply, and epidemics could sweep through neighborhoods before authorities could respond. Medicine itself was in transition. Germ theory was only beginning to gain ground, and many treatments still clung to older practices. Poor ventilation in homes and hospitals made respiratory illnesses worse, and few yet understood the life-saving value of clean air. In the end, survival often depended as much on luck, on whether a family could find warmth, food, and rest, as on any doctor's remedy. For the wealthy, medical care softened winter's blow. For the poor, it was a thin and fragile shield. Food, always a matter of survival, became a glaring marker of class when the frost set in. Behind shutters and in well-stocked pantries, the rich feasted. Preserved goods, salted meats, dried fruits, oysters, and game, with Christmas dinners of goose or turkey and puddings soaked in brandy. For them, winter food was abundance and social ritual. For the poor, winter meant tightening rations. Bread, often coarse or stale and sometimes adulterated, and boiled potatoes were staples. Meat was a rarity. Thin broths or gruel stretched by a single bone might be the best they could manage for days. Street vendors filled some gaps with roasted chestnuts, baked potatoes, or eel pies, cheap, warming treats that for a moment eased hunger. But scarcity, high prices, and coal shortages that made cooking difficult turned even found food into a struggle. Charities and soup kitchens offered hot meals and lifelines, yet lines were long and the supplies limited. Children felt hunger most acutely. Malnutrition left them weak and vulnerable to the illnesses that winter brought. Clothing, in that climate, was survival. For those who could afford it, winter dress was both protection and display. Heavy wool coats lined with fur, gloves and scarves, mufflers and well-made boots that kept out the wet and the cold. For the poor, clothing was a patchwork of scavenged and repaired pieces, thin garments layered, patched, and handed down until fabric held together more by memory than thread. Boots wore through, fingers and toes went numb in damp weather, and mothers stitched and mended with a determination that was as much about pride as necessity. Clothing also carried health risks. Exposure led quickly to colds, frostbite, and infections that could become deadly. Still, even in rags, people preserved dignity where they could, keeping garments as clean as possible and wearing patched coats with quiet resolve. No group suffered winter's bite more than children. For the privileged, winter might be a time of warm nurseries, hot broth, and private ponds to skate on. For the poor, childhood could be a daily battle. Bare feet on frozen cobbles, thin clothing soaked through, hunger gnawing at small bellies. Many children worked the streets as match sellers, newspaper hawkers, or scavengers, or were set to tasks in workhouses where food was regular, but the labor brutal. Infant mortality spiked in cold seasons. Mothers sometimes woke to the unthinkable sight of a child gone still from the night. And yet, in alleys and corners, children found ways to hold on, sharing warmth, playing small games, and turning brief moments of laughter into quiet acts of resistance against the freeze. For the poorest, winter work was the only way to survive. Street trades, roasted chestnuts over braziers, hot-baked potatoes wrapped in cloth, match girls calling their wares, filled the foggy lanes. Some trades were humble but life-sustaining. Crossing sweepers cleared slush for a coin. Boys hawked newspapers. Families scavenged bones, scrap metal, or spilled coal to sell by the penny. Much of this labor fell to children, whose small hands and voices could draw the sympathy of passers-by. Every sale could mean a bowl of soup that evening or another scuttle of coal to last a day longer. Across the city, winter revealed the cruel arithmetic of survival. Warmth, food, shelter, and work decided who endured and who did not. Yet even among that hardship, countless small acts of care flickered through the fog. Neighbors sharing a blanket, strangers tossing a coin, missions handing out a dish of soup. Those gestures did not erase the cold, but they kept people alive long enough to see another dawn. Mothers sent daughters out to sell flowers even in winter, though the blooms would soon wither in the frost. Fathers taught sons to shine boots on cold street corners, fighting icy slush that made the job nearly impossible. Every small trade told the same story, resilience born of desperation. The streets were harsh, competition fierce, and profits meager, yet those pennies, a chestnut, a match, a polished boot, often meant the difference between a warm meal and another night in the cold. Survival in Victorian London was not built on steady wages. It was carved out coin by coin. The Thames was the city's lifeblood, and in winter it became something else entirely, moody, treacherous, and unpredictable. Frost clenched the river's edges, jagged ice clinging to the banks while tributaries stilled. Bargemen fought a sluggish current, cargoes delayed or spoiled as cold tightened its grip. Coal shipments, vital for keeping homes and factories warm, could be slowed for days, sending prices up and sparking new hardship for families already scraping by. A single freeze on the river could ripple across the whole city, leaving thousands shivering in underheated rooms. Fog turned the Thames into a nightmare. Thick, choking mist swallowed bridges and muffled the cries of sailors. Barges collided in the gloom, cargo slumping into icy water. Ferrymen moved cautiously, their lanterns barely cutting the haze while passengers huddled and prayed for a safe crossing. Yet even the river held moments of wonder. When ice thickened enough, people risked stepping onto its surface. Children skated along the edges. Market stalls sometimes popped up on the frozen expanse, and for brief hours the city seemed to mock the season, refusing to surrender entirely to winter's grasp. Shelter, coal, food, clothing, and work. Each piece of that puzzle decided who would endure the winter and who would suffer. The season exposed the sharpest divisions of Victorian London, but it also showed quiet acts of care, neighbors sharing garments, families pooling a few coins for a scuttle of coal, strangers offering what little warmth they could. In the end, winter was not only a test of bodies, it was a test of a city's compassion and the lengths people would go to keep one another alive through the long frost. They often collapsed from sheer exhaustion. Wages were so low that a warm meal was never guaranteed, and yet women kept the household together by sheer will. They coaxed weak fires back to life, stretched meager rations across days, and patched clothing until there was nothing left to mend. They comforted sick children, buried the dead, and rose the next morning to do it all again. Their heroism was quiet and relentless, rarely recorded in history, but essential to a family's survival through the long frost. While men pulled shifts on docks and in factories, women carried a double burden of work and care. In the slums, they were the ones who bore the weight of winter day after day, rationing food, tending to the ill, and finding small ways to keep children warm. Winter did not spare them, but it revealed a stubborn strength. Even when history overlooks their names, the endurance of these women explains why so many families managed to survive the bitter months. For those without roofs, however, the season was often a sentence. The streets of Victorian London could be merciless. Men, women, and children with nowhere to go curled up beneath railway arches, in shop doorways or beside riverbanks, wrapped in sacking or newspapers if they were lucky. Many simply never woke after a particularly harsh night. City officers were accustomed to finding people who had not survived the cold. Public shelters existed, but they were far too few for the number who needed them. Those who found a place in a shelter discovered that comfort was limited. A hard bench or a patch of floor in an overcrowded hall was better than the open air, but the rooms remained cold, and fires, if there were any, were small and inadequate. The air in these spaces was heavy with coughs and the smell of unwashed clothes. Illness moved quickly through such crowded quarters. For many, the workhouse offered another possibility, a bleak option that came wrapped in shame. The workhouse, reformed under the Poor Law, was meant to deter dependence by making relief harsh. In winter, its severity sharpened. Desperate people lined up outside the gates hoping for admission. Some were turned away because the halls were full. Those admitted faced immediate separation from their families. Men, women, and children were divided at the door, and the warmth of kinship was replaced by cold stone walls and a strict regimen. Inside the workhouse, daily life was Spartan. Fires were few and often reserved. High ceilings trapped the little warmth that existed above the heads of those gathered below. The food was plain and regular: gruel, bread, sometimes broth, enough to stave off starvation, but little else. Labor was the price of shelter. Men broke stones, repaired ropes, and performed back-breaking tasks in icy yards. Women scrubbed floors and washed laundry in freezing water. Children were set to carry loads or pick fibers. Illness spread fast in these crowded conditions, and for some the workhouse became less a refuge than a place where weakened bodies gave out. Homeless children were the hardest sight of all. Orphans and runaways huddled in groups beneath bridges or beside market stalls, sharing scraps and guarding one another through the night. Some joined gangs for protection. Others begged on corners, their voices thin and hungry. A penny might buy a crust of bread or a cheap lodging for a night, but when coins failed to appear, the cold returned with merciless certainty. Passers-by sometimes looked on with pity and offered help. Others turned away. The contrast between fashionable winterwear and ragged bundles in alleyways was painfully stark. Work did not stop for winter. If anything, necessity made it more urgent. Vendors stood for hours in sleet and snow selling matches, roasted chestnuts or small trinkets. For them, every sale might mean a meal. Laborers risked falls on icy streets, fragile scaffolding, and overturned carriages in the fog. To stop working was to risk starvation, so people returned to dangerous jobs day after day despite the cost to their bodies. Disease rode the cold months alongside frost and hunger. London's smoke and overcrowding turned winter into a breeding ground for illness. Damp air settled into lungs and brought bronchitis, pneumonia, and consumption. The infamous fogs, thick with soot and sulfur from countless fires, made breathing harder and the spread of respiratory disease worse. Cold and damp also aggravated rheumatism and exposed people to frostbite. For those sleeping outdoors, exposure could be fatal. In tenements, a single sick child could mean an outbreak for an entire building, and workhouses, meant to protect, sometimes amplified the spread. Children were the most vulnerable of all. In wealthier homes, they slept warm and fed. In the slums, they scavenged for coal, carried water, and worked long hours to bring in a few pennies. Malnutrition left their bodies weak, unable to keep heat, and illness followed close behind. Yet, among the hardship, there were flickers of tenderness. Children huddled together for warmth, shared scraps of bread, or took brief, bright pleasure in a vendor's hot chestnuts. Those small moments of joy were fragile, but they persisted. Women bore an extraordinary share of the burden. Mothers rationed what little food there was so children could eat first, sometimes tearing apart their own garments to wrap a baby. Laundresses, seamstresses, and market sellers worked in freezing basins or stood in sleet for hours, hands raw and voices hoarse. Their sacrifices were threaded through each household's survival. Without them, many families would have collapsed. Still, winter also showed the quieter sides of human generosity. Neighbors pooled a few coins for coal, shared garments, and offered beds or a corner by the fire when they could. Strangers sometimes became the difference between life and death. In a city of stark divisions, these acts of care were a reminder that beneath the cruelty of the season, people kept one another alive in small, vital ways. The picture of Victorian London in winter is one of hardship and resilience intertwined. Shelter, coal, food, clothing, and work decided who endured and who suffered. But beneath the harsh facts are countless stories of courage, of women holding families together, of children finding warmth in each other, and of strangers offering what little they had. Winter tested bodies and spirits alike, and the ways people endured tell us as much about their humanity as about the severity of the cold. Without warmth, bodies grew weak. Without light, spirits sank. Yet when a small fire crackled in a grate or a single candle flame danced against the shadows, Londoners, rich and poor alike, felt a tiny, stubborn reminder that life still held a spark worth clutching. In the darkest months, people chased those sparks wherever they could find them, seeking out joy, distraction, and moments of togetherness that pushed back against the cold. Still, the ways people chased that warmth were sharply divided by class. For the wealthy, winter unfolded across glittering social calendars, theaters filled with revivals and operas, music halls echoed with song and laughter, and private balls and dinners turned long nights into occasions. Gaslight warmed velvet seats and gilded balconies. Parlors were hung with greenery and candlelight. Christmas came with decorated trees, fine toys, and tables heavy with food. For those households, the season was as much about celebration as survival. Middle-class families found simpler comforts at home. They gathered around the piano to sing carols, played cards by the fire, and read aloud as snow drifted past the windows. Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol helped shape a new idea of the holiday, one of family, generosity, and warmth. And its influence reached into even modest homes where a sprig of holly or a small shared meal could turn a winter evening into something special. For the poor, festivities were rarer but not absent. Street musicians played fiddles and barrel organs for pennies or simply for the joy of being heard. Markets swelled with holiday trade as families scraped together savings for a joint of meat or a portion of plum pudding. Children pressed their noses to shop windows, marveling at toys they could not afford, their faces lit with longing and wonder. Public spaces offered relief too. When ice formed thick enough, ponds and river stretches hosted skaters and crowds drawn from every class. Cheap theaters and music halls provided a few pennies worth of escape. For many who had little, an evening of laughter or a shared song was a kind of survival, nourishment for the spirit as essential as a bowl of soup. Religion played a central role in that winter life. Churches and chapels became places of warmth, charity, and moral counsel. On Sundays, bell tones cut through the fog and drew people into heated pews or drafty mission rooms alike. For wealthier worshippers, attendance blended devotion with respectability. For the poor, church was often the only sanctuary from the streets. Sermons spoke of duty and compassion, and congregations received both spiritual solace and practical aid. Soup kitchens, blankets, and donated coal were organized through parishes and charitable societies, especially at Christmas when appeals for goodwill often turned into tangible help. Mothers sometimes skipped their own meals to feed their children, wasting away quietly so little ones might survive. Workhouses promised food, but it was often little more than gruel or plain bread. Nourishment with dignity stripped away, offered inside bleak halls. Pride kept many families from seeking that help until desperation forced their hand. Cooking itself became a challenge. Without coal or wood, many could not even heat what little they had. A stale crust of bread dipped in cold water might serve as dinner. Some relied on public cookshops where, for a few pennies, they could buy a bowl of something hot if not especially nourishing. Alcohol provided a different kind of fuel. Gin shops stayed busy through winter as people sought the brief, false warmth of drink. For a moment, spirits dulled the ache of cold and hunger, but the relief faded quickly, often leaving bodies weaker than before. Yet in a city with few options, a penny's worth of gin could feel like the only escape from the endless ache of frost and empty stomachs. Food, in Victorian London, became a measure of class, dignity, and resilience. For the wealthy, winter was almost festive. For the poor, it was a test of endurance where every bite mattered and hunger felt like a second, invisible winter. If food fueled the body and coal fueled the fire, shelter was the fortress meant to guard against the cold. But shelter in Victorian London was divided sharply by wealth and circumstance. Where you lived often decided whether the season would be endured in comfort or suffered in misery. For those with money, townhouses in districts like Mayfair or Kensington were built to keep out the worst of the weather. Sturdy brick, high ceilings, thick curtains, and servants tending the fires. Coal cellars brimmed with fuel and multiple fireplaces could be kept burning day and night. Rugs and heavy drapery insulated rooms against drafts. In these homes, winter sat quietly in the background of social gatherings, dinners, and evenings spent by a warm hearth. In the crowded slums of East London, shelter offered little more than walls against the wind. Tenements often crammed entire families into single rooms that were damp, dark, and full of drafts. Rain leaked through roofs, frost crept along cracked walls, and dampness clung to everything. Windows, if they weren't broken, rattled with every gust. Thin panes offered little defense. Many rooms had no chimneys at all, forcing families to endure nights without even the hope of a fire. Overcrowding made everything worse. Dozens might live in one building, stacked floor upon floor with poor ventilation and almost no privacy. In winter, bodies pressed close together, not by choice but by necessity. The air turned heavy with smoke from shared fires, and the dampness of wet clothes hung up to dry. The smell of rot and unwashed garments mixed with the cold, turning homes into suffocating, unhealthy spaces. For the homeless, shelter meant whatever could be found. Some slept beneath railway arches or bridges wrapped in sacks or newspapers. Others huddled in doorways, barely visible beneath thin rags. A fortunate few found a place in night shelters, rows of hard benches where dozens of people huddled together. These spaces offered protection from the worst of the wind, but not the bitter cold. Workhouses, grim and authoritarian, also became winter refugees. Families who resisted for the sake of pride often gave in when the cold turned unbearable. Inside, conditions were harsh, fires limited, and warmth meager, but at least there were walls, and for many that made the difference between life and death. Housing in Victorian London was therefore not just about comfort. It was about survival. A wealthy family could close shutters against the frost and carry on, while a poor family might spend the same night awake, teeth chattering, praying the roof would hold. Shelter was the line drawn between endurance and exposure, and that line was traced sharply along class. Work did not stop for winter. If anything, the need to earn wages became more desperate because survival depended on pennies that might buy coal, bread, or a night in shelter. Men, women, and children labored through brutal cold, bodies pushed to the edge by necessity. On the streets, vendors braved icy winds to sell matches, roasted chestnuts, hot pies, or cheap trinkets, small trades that might pull a family through another day. The city kept moving, even as the fog and frost thickened, and for many, the daily grind of earning enough to survive was the real winter battle. Standing in the bitter air was its own kind of agony. Sellers stamped their feet, blew into their cupped hands, and wrapped themselves in layers of rags, trying to keep feeling in their toes. The fog that swallowed carriages also muffled their cries of matches, matches, or hot pies here, forcing them to shout louder just to be heard. It was exhausting work, and without selling, there was no meal that night. Laborers faced even harsher conditions. Dock workers unloaded ships under freezing spray, their hands raw and swollen where water turned to ice on the skin. Builders and street cleaners battled frostbitten fingers as they laid bricks or swept slush from roads. Inside factories, the roar of machines offered some shelter from the wind, but the halls remained cold. The engines gave off warmth, never quite enough, and workers often tended the machinery with coats still on. Women's work was no gentler. Laundresses scrubbed garments in icy water until their hands cracked and bled, and match girls walked miles selling tiny boxes for pennies beneath thin shawls that offered little protection. Domestic servants rose before dawn to light fires in rooms they would never enjoy, their own bodies shivering as they worked to warm someone else's comfort. Children were caught up in the labor too. Boys known as mudlarks scavenged along frozen riverbanks, hoping to find stray coal or rope to sell. Errand runners tramped through sleet and snow. Tiny chimney sweeps climbed flues that gave them no respite from the cold. Malnourished and exhausted, many of these children were pushed beyond what their small bodies could bear, and sickness became a constant companion. Winter made dangerous jobs even deadlier. Slippery streets led to falls, Icy scaffolding sometimes collapsed under weight, and carriages overturned in the fog, crushing those unlucky enough to be nearby. Still, laborers returned each day. To stop working was to risk starvation. Passers-by in warmer districts might glance with a mixture of pity and indifference, their gloved hands safely tucked into fur-lined muffs, unaware that for the poor winter, labor was not just toil, but survival played out against a biting wind and a constant shadow of hunger. If cold and hunger were terrible enemies, disease was the invisible one that followed close behind. London's smoke-choked, overcrowded streets turned the cold months into a breeding ground for illness. Damp, bone-deep air settled into lungs, and respiratory complaints, bronchitis, pneumonia, and tuberculosis, spread rapidly. The famous fogs, thick with soot and sulfur from countless coal fires, poisoned the very air people tried to breathe. Doctors reported fog fever, and the winter death toll from lung diseases rose year after year. It wasn't only lungs at risk. Cold and damp inflamed joints, bringing rheumatism that left workers hobbling and unable to earn a wage. Frostbite blackened fingers and toes for those sleeping in the open or walking miles in broken boots. In overcrowded tenements, a single sick child could infect an entire building. Measles, whooping cough, and influenza swept through unventilated rooms where families huddled together. Workhouses, intended as refuge, often turned into traps for disease. Hundreds crammed into drafty halls where infection ran fast. And for many, the promise of shelter came with a cost. Of all those battered by frost and fog, children suffered most. In wealthy homes, a child might be cocooned in wool coats and feather beds, their nurseries warm and bright. In the slums, childhood looked very different. Many had no shoes, their toes purple and raw from puddles and ice. Clothing was thin and endlessly patched. Snow did not mean play, but scavenging. Searching for coal scraps, carrying water or goods through frozen streets to earn a penny. Malnutrition left young bodies unable to generate heat, their cheeks hollow and energies drained. Illness followed close behind, and too often the graveyards filled with small markers for lives lost far too soon. And yet even in such hardship there were moments of human resilience. Children huddled together for warmth, shared pieces of bread, and found ways to laugh between chores. A stray snowball fight, the rare pleasure of a vendor's hot chestnuts. Those small sparks of joy were fragile but real, a reminder that life's tenderness could persist amid the cold. Winter fell especially hard on women. For middle and upper-class women, the season posed inconveniences, cold hands or damp shoes. But for working-class women, it often meant ceaseless labor that drained body and spirit. Mothers rationed the little food they had so children might eat, sometimes tearing their own shawls into patches for little ones. Laundresses and seamstresses worked in freezing basins and dim rooms, their hands raw from water and soap. Street sellers stood for hours in sleet, voices hoarse from calling out goods while sometimes carrying infants wrapped in rags against the cold. London in the 1800s was a city of sharp contrasts. On one side, grand houses glowed with gaslight, warm rooms full of laughter and roaring fireplaces. On the other, cramped slums funneled the wind straight into the bones of the poor. Winter in Victorian London was more than a season. It was an ordeal, a test of endurance that made the gap between wealth and poverty painfully obvious. The rich could buy warmth. The poor had to fight for it. Picture the fog that gave London its reputation, thickening in the cold months until whole streets seemed to vanish in a ghostly haze. Horse hooves clattered on icy cobbles and the scrape of street sweepers echoed through the night. Families huddled under thin blankets, their breath frosting in rooms colder than the streets outside. Children coughed from the cold and the soot that poured from thousands of chimneys. For many, winter was not charming or festive. It was survival. Even within that struggle, there were moments of resilience and small victories, and a slow, uneasy realization that industrial progress came at a cost to people's lives. This story of Victorian winters isn't just about weather. It's about the chill of poverty, disease, and inequality, and what it meant to be human when the world beyond your door was frozen and unforgiving. Before we peel back those layers of frost and history, take a moment to settle in. If you're new here, welcome. This channel tries to tell history like a story, alive, vivid, and full of human details you won't always find in textbooks. Wherever you are, late at night or on a frosty morning, you're part of this journey. So pull a chair closer, Tuck a blanket around your knees and imagine stepping into a city lit by gaslight and shadowed by smog. The first and most relentless enemy was the weather itself. It wasn't only cold, it was a bone-deep chill that crept through brick, through wool, and through resolve. London's dampness made the cold especially cruel. When icy winds met the ever-present moisture, the result was a penetrating, lingering damp that no number of blankets could fully banish. Unlike the sharp, dry winters further north, London's cold soaked into the bones and stayed. Then came the fog, the infamous pea-soupers that turned the air a sickly yellow-gray. These were not harmless mists. Mixed with smoke from countless coal fires, the fog became a choking haze that smelled of sulfur and ash. Horses stumbled, carriages collided, and people sometimes lost their way in their own neighborhoods. The fog could even creep indoors, turning curtains and clothing a grim brown. Snow, though less frequent than fog, brought its own threats. A heavy fall could paralyze the city, freeze the temperatures, and turn cobbles into treacherous ice. Children might laugh as they slid across the frozen ground, but for the poor, snow was often a disaster. Slush soaked through thin shoes, water froze in pipes, and those without steady shelter found themselves in mortal danger. Wind howling down narrow alleys found every crack in tenement walls, whistling reminders of how vulnerable some families were. There were no insulated windows, no double glazing, no central heating. A draft could turn a single-room dwelling into something colder than the street. In the worst storms, even small hearth fires seemed powerless against the overwhelming chill. Before hunger, disease, or poverty even had their say, nature had already declared war on the city. For many, every winter was a season of survival. If the weather was the enemy, then fire was the only defense. Coal was king. Nearly every household relied on it to heat a room, cook a meal, or keep damp from settling into clothes and bedding. In wealthy homes, coal arrived by the cartload, stacked in cellars until winter. Roaring fires reflected off velvet curtains and polished silver, making long nights seem cozy. In the crowded slums, coal was bought by the sack or the scuttle, a little at a time. Vendors roamed the streets. Desperate parents haggled over handfuls of coal as if they were treasure. When coal ran out, people burned anything they could find, broken furniture, wooden crates, even scraps of clothing. And the air inside those homes grew thick and acrid, stinging eyes and lungs. Often the only alternative was long nights shivering under threadbare blankets, bodies huddled together for warmth. Fires were frequently reserved for cooking. Homes might be only warmed for a few hours each day. Workhouses meant to shelter the needy were notoriously cold, rationing whatever heat they had. The homeless crowded into night shelters, under bridges or in railway arches, anywhere that blocked the wind. Clothing became a vital shield against the merciless chill. But like warmth itself, clothing revealed class and resourcefulness. Layers of wool and fur turned winter into an inconvenience for some, while rags left others exposed to every gust. The wealthy wrapped themselves in thick tailored overcoats, fur-lined collars, top hats, leather gloves, and heavy cloaks. Their attire was as much protection as it was fashion. For many poor families, garments were patched and layered until they barely held together, each wind like a knife. Winter in Victorian London was harsh, unrelenting, and unforgettable. It was a season that tested bodies and spirits, and revealed in brutal detail who could buy comfort and who had to beg or improvise it. But among the cold and the fog there were stories of kindness, of people sharing what little they had, and of communities doing what they could to keep one another alive through the long frost. Their boots were polished, their stockings thick, and beneath it all they wore layers of undergarments meant to hold heat close. For the well-off, clothing was more than protection. It was fashion, a way to show wealth even in the coldest months. But for the working poor, winter dress was a patchwork of necessity. Coats were handed down, patched and patched again until they were more whole in memory than in fabric. Shoes were thin and worn, soles splitting to let icy slush in. Some children trudged barefoot through snow, toes purple from the cold. Others tied rags around their feet in a desperate attempt at warmth. Hats, if they had them, were battered caps or scarves pulled tight over the ears. Layering became the rule of survival. Poor families piled on every garment they owned. Shirts under threadbare sweaters, trousers over trousers, skirts over skirts, and slept in those same layers, unwilling to strip off the only insulation they had. Washing winter clothing was rare. Who could risk being without the single barrier between skin and frost, even for a day? Clothes grew stiff with grime, but they were far too precious to leave unworn. Clothing also marked identity. Chimney sweeps, faces black with soot, wore the same thin rags in which they worked. Match girls huddled in shawls so thin they offered more illusion than warmth. By contrast, cloaks and furs made the upper class appear untouchable, cocooned from the suffering a street away. In that way, winter attire was both practical and symbolic, a constant reminder of who belonged to comfort and who belonged to hardship. Even so, there was a stubborn, resourceful resilience in how London's poor dressed. Mothers cut and stitched scraps into makeshift mittens. Fathers reinforced boots with nails and pieces of leather scavenged from workshops. Neighbors shared garments so no child walked to school completely exposed. Clothing could not erase winter's bite, but it became a canvas of survival, stitched together with ingenuity and grit. In Victorian London, to be dressed warmly was a privilege. To be dressed at all was often a fight. Every shawl, coat, and boot told a story, not just of the season's cruelty, but of the lengths people went to endure it. If warmth kept the body from freezing, food kept it alive. And what you ate, or couldn't eat, often decided whether your winter would be endured or suffered. The human body burns more energy in the cold, constantly working to maintain heat. But calories were a luxury for many in London, and hunger gnawed as harshly as the frost. For the wealthy, winter was a season of plenty. Kitchens in grand townhouses buzzed with servants preparing roasts, steaming pies, rich soups, and puddings sweetened with imported fruits. Hot drinks, tea, cocoa, mulled wine, soothed and warmed, while buttered bread and pastries were plentiful. Food for them was comfort, variety, and a bulwark against the cold. In the slums, the picture was starkly different. Families crammed into tiny rooms lived on the cheapest meals: bread, dripping porridge, or thin broth stretched by boiling a single bone over several days. Potatoes, cheap and filling, were a staple because they could be cooked on the smallest fires. Street vendors hawked roasted chestnuts or hot eels, small, affordable comforts that offered a momentary warmth. Yet even these treats were out of reach for many. Hunger was constant, and winter made it worse. Malnutrition spread, and children suffered most. Small bodies that could not generate enough heat without sufficient food grew thin, tired, and susceptible to illness.